Director Jude Gerard Prest brings us Anneliese, the Exorcist tapes, which is a 2011 found footage movie, also known as Paranormal Entity 3, the Exorcist tapes. And this one stars Nikki Muller as Anneliese Michel. Now, this is actually based on a real event, a true story. Ultimately, though, this is a fictionalised version of this. Now, the Paranormal Entity 3 kind of title refers to a loosely kind of curated found footage movies that have been kind of put together ultimately to take advantage of the Paranormal Activity movies. They represent no actual ongoing series. There's simply 3 different movies, and that's actually more than 3, to be honest. Okay, so this is a little bit of a controversial one because ultimately this movie, as I say, is based on a recorded true event. Now, in the mid-70s, there was a young lady called Anneliese Michel who was suspected to have been possessed, and she had a variety of exorcisms and things like this, but ultimately she died. She actually died of starvation and dehydration, and actually the medical diagnosis was that she had schizophrenia, and the parents and 2 priests that were involved in these exorcisms were actually charged with negligent homicide, ultimately through these kind of neglect and looking only at the kind of the spiritual side of things. Ultimately it was deemed that she had died due to neglect. So it's a pretty tragic case, and this apparently was the inspiration for the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. And so in 2011 we had the Asylum. Yes, the Asylum decided to make a movie based on the actual true events, albeit it's a fictionalised version, because in this movie Anneliese actually kills a bunch of people, which she didn't do in real life. Okay, so yeah, a little bit of a taste issue, you can argue, with this one, but let's talk about the plot. So yeah, it focuses on this Anneliese, played by Nikki Muller, who is this young woman who is apparently possessed, and we kind of are led to believe when the movie starts it's already been going on for a couple of years, and the medical profession hasn't been able to kind of help her, so the family has turned to the church, and to this point they're still not able to help her. They're trying to do these kind of religious rituals and exorcisms to try and rid this spirit. And the movie follows a small documentarian crew who are following these scientists who are kind of sent to check up on her, and ultimately the bulk of the movie is really the confrontation between the scientists and the kind of these priests who ultimately think they both know best about how to help her. In the meantime, you've got Anneliese displaying an increasing amount of demonic activity, and in this movie at least she ultimately kills a bunch of people. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out, but I've kind of told you the end in the real case there. Now, what can we say that works in this movie? Now, The Asylum. The Asylum is if you're not familiar, a American production company that churns out very cheap movies, often kind of mockbusters, and in actual fact, as you can see, this English version is clearly kind of aimed at tapping into that Paranormal Activity kind of, franchise. Anyway, so I will say though, I think the actress who plays Anneliese, Nikki Muller, actually does a pretty good job, because she's actually asked to do quite a lot here. She's playing various different kind of stages of possession. Sometimes she's kind of speaking as a demon, sometimes she's speaking in different languages, various kind of states of kind of angriness and volatile kind of behaviour. Sometimes she's kind of softer and speaking more as kind of Anneliese. So I think she does a pretty good job, and I think sometimes it's easy to kind of tar asylum movies just having bad acting, but it's not always true. I think if you do look, you can find some good performances in some asylum films, and I think it's true of this one. But I would say there are other performances that are at least okay in this movie. It's a mixed bag. I mean, ultimately this movie's meant to be taking place in Germany, but most of the dialogue is in English. We have a couple of characters who kind of speak German, and a couple of characters that are speaking English but in a German accent, and there are some like American characters in the movie, but You know, there's some actors who I think do an okay job, to be honest. Some are a little kind of on the cheesy side, I will admit, and don't particularly come across as necessarily realistic. But some, I have to say, and including Nikki Muller, do a reasonable job at the very least. There are a couple of interesting points that this movie kind of makes. Again, you can throw away a movie like this and say, oh, it's the asylum, it's going to be crap. But in one of the kind of the faux interviews, because this movie is kind of peppered with interviews with the clergy and kind of medical professionals, obviously actors playing them, but and that one of the kind of the points that one of the the characters that are doctors sort of says is that they believe that the church is ultimately kind of feeding the delusion, and when they're doing all these kind of exorcisms and kind of like rituals that are trying to rid this demon, it's ultimately fueling the psychosis that this this girl has and kind of making it ultimately worse, which I think was an interesting kind of element that goes into it. So I thought that was actually fairly kind of interesting. There's actually a couple of reasonable effects. Again, this is a low budget movie. There's a kind of minimal effects throughout the movie, but there's a couple of reasonable ones, I think. In a movie like this, where it's a kind of meant to be a found footage movie, it's meant to be taking place in the 70s, so obviously the picture's not brilliant. They can get away with some of the asylum level effects that kind of do look kind of realistic in this kind of context, so I thought that was kind of okay. And obviously the subject matter being based on a kind of a true story has that sort of darker feel, and I think one of the main points that this movie likes to kind of advertise is it does actually feature real recordings of the real life Anneliese actually in the movie. So a few times through the movie you'll actually hear audio recordings of the real events, the real kind of possession, or apparent possession that are played through the film. So that kind of gives it a little bit of a kind of spooky vibe, to be honest, because you are listening to real recordings there. So that's the positives. Let's talk about the negatives. Okay, it's an asylum movie. I mean, it is somewhat exploitative, you might argue. This being somewhat of a real-life tragedy, you can argue that it's in bad taste to kind of, portray someone who, in this movie, definitely kind of portrays it like she was possessed. There's clearly supernatural stuff going on. It doesn't really try and kind of like muddy the waters. Is it kind of a medical issue or is it kind of a possession? It's like, well, according to this movie, it's pretty much guaranteed to be a possession. So it's certainly kind of laying its eggs in that kind of basket. And ultimately, you do see this character kill, I think, 3 people in the movie, and being based on a real person who didn't do that, you could argue, yeah, it's a little exploitative, it's a little bit bad taste, you could argue. So there you go. That's going to be a matter for you to decide, I suppose. But what can we say outside of that? I mean, as I said, I think some of the acting was good, but there are some poor performances. And in some of these, it doesn't really make sense why the bulk of the kind of dialogue would be in English. Again, the real reason is so they can distribute it to Western markets. That's why. But for the context of a narrative, it really doesn't make a huge amount of sense, to be fair. And some of these kind of like faux German accents are a little bit kind of like on that. Some are good and some aren't so good. And let me just put it like that. I think the real issue for me, however, is that this movie is not a lot of narrative momentum. We come into this movie with Anneliese already being kind of tied up upstairs, more or less, and kind of being possessed and having this affliction for 2 years, I think they mentioned. So you're not even seeing the kind of the beginnings of it. And ultimately, it's over a short space of time. And the bulk of the movie is either faux interviews or these kind of doctors arguing with the clergy, and that's the bulk of the running time. Occasionally, Anneliese, as the character, will kind of end up having an interaction with someone that's kind of like, she's talking about secrets that they'll know, or she'll be doing kind of spooky stuff. But the bulk of the kind of the running time is just that. So you don't really feel like you're getting a huge amount of actual kind of story. It more or less just feels like it's, one scene almost, but just kind of like, almost it feels like it's, there are actual sequences, right? I do think they kind of repeat some of the visuals, but it feels just a bit stretched out, to be honest with you. And I have to say, the concept of a found footage movie in the 70s, it's a little bit, you know, obviously technology wasn't exactly what it is today, let's just say that. And the quality of the pictures, it looks like it's got filters on it and things like that. It's clearly like, you know, modern kind of cameras and things. I mean, I reviewed another found footage movie that was 1974, The Possession of Alatar. It was called, and they actually used real 16mm cameras, I think, to try and get that retro film. Here it's clearly shot digital and just kind of has a filter on it, so it kind of looks like that. So again, we're talking about the Asylum, we're talking about quick production, churn them out, that sort of thing, so it doesn't quite have that authenticity that it's kind of trying to kind of portray there. And, you know, it becomes a little bit cheesy at times, and it becomes a little bit dull at times as well. So, you know, if you read reviews of this movie, a lot of them are very, very bad, but there are a couple of elements here that I do think preventing it from being completely unwatchable, but it's certainly not a great movie, and it's certainly not an entertaining movie, and arguably it's not in the best taste either. I'll give this one a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.